Serious, what experience have you had that you feel can only be explained by the paranormal? Years ago my mill died in my living room. She had a massive pulmonary embolus, so it was sudden and traumatic. My so is a physician and was with her and our children when it occurred. I was at class. My so did CPR on her all the way to the hospital. A week after her funeral I'm alone in the house at around 3:45 p.m. about the time the kids came home. Suddenly I hear blasting out the sound of a million birds. Inside my house. I figured the kids had come in without me hearing them and had turned the TV on too high. I yelled, "Turn it down now." The sound immediately stops. I continue folding laundry. Then I hear the sound of keys in the lock at the front door. I walk to the entry in time to see all 4 of our kids come in. They all swore they just got off the school bus, which I could see pulling up the street. A month or so later my so's aunt visited and tearfully told of hearing a bunch of birds singing after her sister, my mill, died. After my mom died, I was crying outside when suddenly a dragonfly landed on my finger. It sat there for a long time. It's happened many times. Once I was surrounded by them, just flying and circling me. I choose to believe my mom was trying to comfort me. Directly after my Phil's funeral, a white owl perched itself on a branch above my husband and my head, stayed there looking at us for at least 10 minutes. Needless to say, I have no doubt that there's life after death. We don't just cease to exist. My father-in-law died a few years ago. My husband was at the funeral home making arrangements and his mom, Phil's nearly 40 years ex-wife, was there to assist him. They were wrapping things up and she stepped outside to have a smoke. Suddenly there was screaming. My husband ran out to find that she had turned around and a gross dead snake was hanging from a branch, right in her face. I'd like to think that was my Phil's doing. In my house growing up, my parents would always leave a lamp on in the living room at night. One morning, we wake up and the light bulb has been torn from the socket. Torn. Not twisted and removed, but the metal was ripped and shredded. Found the bulb in the middle of the floor. Part of it was still in the socket. The presence in that house was very tangible, but whatever it was you could feel that it thrived in the dark. But damn, it could have just hit the switch to turn the light off. My grandpa, Mom's dad, passed away in 2003 when I was 9. Him and I were very close, so my mom and I would visit him at the cemetery a lot. About a year after he passed, whenever we would go I would wander off and hang out by a specific plot of a 17-year-old boy that had just passed. My mom didn't think much of it and never brought it up to me until 3 years ago. We had gone to the cemetery and I saw the boy's grave and was overcome with sadness and felt the need to Google him. I found out he died in a car accident and was a star soccer player at his high school and an all-around nice guy. For months, he would randomly pop into my head and I would feel extremely sad and like there was a huge weight on my chest. A few months after this, I went to a psychic with my mom and she asked me who the 17-year-old who died in the car accident was. She proceeded to explain to me that he's always been attached to me and he needs me to find a way to tell his mom he's okay. Now, there is no way she could have known this, so I was a little freaked out. I went home and found his mom's Facebook and sent her a message. She answered back a little while later explaining that she never uses Facebook but something made her check it and that she was also very grateful for the message. She also informed me that the next day was the 10-year anniversary of her son's passing. After I sent that message, whenever I thought of him I no longer felt that intense sadness or heaviness, and I always make sure to pay him a visit when I go to the cemetery to visit my grandpa. Then last year, I went to the cemetery and my mom asked me if I had ever spoken to that kid's mom again. I said no because I would feel weird just messaging her out of nowhere. My mom said, "Maybe he'll send you a sign so you reach out to her." We got in the car and my radio and all of the buttons started going crazy. My mom was convinced it was a sign but I said it was probably a malfunction and I would need something clearer than that. Later that day I was on my way to my boyfriend's house and I passed the road that the kid at the cemetery passed away on. I said, "Craig, if you want me to message your mom again, send me a sign. Put your name on something." My boyfriend and I went to the Cheesecake Factory that night and the first cheesecake I saw was called Craig's Crazy Cake or something like that. I was shocked even though it was something so small. I've had a couple of experiences like that but that was one of the strangest and intense I've ever had. I know exactly why you mean about the sadness and weight on your chest. I was out on a hike one day, some would call it trespassing, but either way we ended up walking down a public road that went through the hills. It was very steep on one side, and I looked in the ravine and saw a Subaru on its roof about 40 feet down. It had been there a while, and I was like, huh, that's not something you see every day, so I took a picture on my phone. And then I saw the small wooden cross on the side of the road. This heavy feeling followed me for weeks. It just felt sad, and something was off. Something was telling me it was from that picture I had taken. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore and deleted the picture, and the feeling went away. When I was about 7, I woke from a nap to see a man in a tweed jacket, flat cap and milk bottle glasses smiling at me. I smiled back and he disappeared. I went and told my mom, describing the man, and she said it was my granddad who died when I was a baby. The toaster and the kettle turned on while I was standing across the room, home alone. I shouted why and ran out the room. Something else lived in that kitchen, I swear. I had a really strange experience 2 weeks ago. I work in a pub with a basement bar that has an interesting history and is very creepy downstairs. I was changing in the downstairs toilet, 2 cubicles, completely silent. I'm the only person downstairs. I locked the cubicle after me and was sending a text before I changed when all of a sudden something slammed against the locked cubicle door hard enough to open it, without breaking the lock, and slammed me in the back. I swung around straight away to give out to whichever of the lads thought this was a funny thing to do cause it hurt. And there was nobody there. Or in the next cubicle. Or downstairs at all. I've tried reasoning it out but I'm drawing a blank. I checked for any draft too. I get changed upstairs now, ha. My girlfriend was bartending at her old job and I went to pick her up. While waiting I was talking to her boss in a stairwell. Up the stairs there was a huge room that they used for storage. They had this game wheel with a pointer, Wheel of Fortune style but vertical. So when you spun the wheel it would make a click 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 sound. We were talking about paranormal shit and he told me even though it's all closed up window-wise up there, sometimes he heard the wheel spin. He said he fucking hated going up there. Little bit later my GF came up to us and asked if we can go up there and grab a few chairs for a party setup. At that exact moment that fucking wheel spun. Her boss looked at me and said, "You're coming with me otherwise she's going," herself motioning to my GF. Now I'm sure it was because I was already freaked out a bit but the energy up there was insane. Something was watching you and you felt it. 2 grown men in their early 30s, with 4 chairs each, scared shitless, running downstairs. We hit the bottom and put chairs down and both started laughing, click 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 click. Again. We had to have several pints to chill out. My theory is that if there's a bar with an attic or basement, then it's haunted. 100% of the time. I was working alone in a warehouse. I know I was alone because I had the keys. I was the guy that locked all the doors behind my guys as they left. I was starting to lay out the office that the warehouse needed, and was getting ready to use a shot shell hammer to drive the nails through the 2x4s into the cement floor. I was just getting ready to pull the plunger, and something stuck a finger in my ear. Full on Wet Willy style. I freaked out. This was from 2 years ago. I went to a coal mining museum with the kids and we were exploring the outdoor part. Came to a small building that had an exhibit inside. Looking through the window I saw a man in there and decided we would wait for him to come out rather than subjecting him to the horror of 2 excited toddlers in a confined space with buttons to press. So we waited and waited, but no one exited and it was empty when we eventually decided to go in. There was only one way in and out of this building and we were in front of it the whole time. I know I saw him in there. My best friend has always been very receptive to psychic and paranormal experiences, as had both her father and her brother. They live near a Revolutionary Way exhibition town that has preserved some of the buildings of the time, including a jail. She told me that when she was a kid her mother took the family to that town and forced her to go to the jail, because she felt that it was important to understand the darker parts of history. There was a presence in there that was so heavy that my friend only managed to last about 5 minutes before she ran outside, threw up, and passed out. She came to her father and brother yelling at their mom, saying that she should have known better after the same thing happened to her brother when he'd gone in there on a school trip. My house is haunted to preface and I've lived in it my entire life. I'm actually typing this out in the house. My mom was going through documents and sorting them one Saturday. She uncovered the original deed from the 1920s and some other documents of family members who've been in/died in the house. That night the door connecting the living room to our porch, which is pretty tightly locked, unlocks and swings open, setting our alarm system off. My brother and I have heard our mother call our names hundreds of times when we were younger. I've heard my name being called by voices I don't recognize. I've seen my dead aunt in the doorway, dark figures peering around the corner at me, and footsteps everywhere in the house. They haven't caused any harm to any of us, so there's that. My wife and I have heard the 30s music as well. Sounds distant, dim and echoes. Always sounds like it's in another room. Every time it happens we check the whole house and outside the house in case it's the neighbors. We've never found anything to explain it. Several winters ago my mom went to an auction and bought an antique bed frame. She brought it home and left it in her room so she'd have it ready when renovations were done. That evening, my parents were watching television in the living room and I was in my bedroom, both of which are at the other end of the house, when the door to my mom's room slammed shut so hard the entire house shook. Our cats were scared shitless and ran off to hide somewhere. Again, this was in the middle of winter, so all our windows were shut, so it couldn't have been the wind. If I remember right, it wasn't windy. Our garage was shut, and there's no way any of our cats could have closed the door hard enough to shake the whole house. When my parents went to investigate, nothing had been knocked over or broken, there was no one in our house, etc. We've never been able to figure out what happened or what could have caused the door to slam shut like that. But needless to say, my mom got a different bed frame. I have no idea what it was, but when I was like 14, about 10 years ago, my mother was driving me home from school one day and it was storming out. We live in a pretty rural area with many large open fields nearby, and upon passing one I looked out and saw what looked like one of those plasma ball toys floating/spinning out in the middle of the field. From the road it looked to be about 50 feet wide. The only thing I can ever come up with on the internet is ball lightning, but never that huge. It always made me question whether what I saw was actually real, but it was in my eyes. My first year in college I lived in a dorm that dated back to the 1970s. While it wasn't that old, it was also in the middle of the woods. Getting there meant traversing through a parking lot, down a flight of stairs, though another parking lot, up 2 flights of stairs through the woods, and then up 3 flights of stairs and through a ton of narrow and winding hallways. It was so much pain to get there, but a lot of people liked the dorm because of how remote it was. My room looked a lot like this one, except above each bed there were shelves connected to the walls. One afternoon I'm there alone, since my roommate is out doing something with her boyfriend. I'm borrowing her bed to do my laundry, as in I'd fold my clothes on her bed then I'd bring it over to mine. I have to mention that my roommate had several items on her wall shelves, including heavy ceramic mugs and some plastic cups. The latter was stacked up on each other and literally wedged into the shelf. You wouldn't be able to get the plastic cups out without a bit of force, so I'm facing her bed doing my thing, and as I turn back around to my bed I immediately hear a crash. I realize that somehow, her ceramic cups and the plastic ones had managed to fall off the shelf and onto the floor. I'm struggling to reach down to get them when it hits me. How the hell did those things fall? I'm also struggling to come up with answers. Yes, the window was open, but based on the angle of the window and the shelves there's no way a breeze could have toppled them over. I then wondered if someone from the floor below smashed their fist against the wall, thus toppling over the cups, but I would have heard that. It then occurred to me that I had no explanation for what happened. Up until that point I'd never been faced with anything supernatural. But it made me wonder if that was the solution, because the rest of the explanations that I'd thought of didn't work. When my roommate came back I told her what happened, and she was just as confused as I was. After that, nothing out of the ordinary happened in that room. I was working at a restaurant in my teenage years that had many paranormal things happen in it, but being the thick-headed 16-year-old I dismissed all these claims as people going crazy. Long story short, one night I had forgot something in the building after a late Friday night and had my boss unlock the door and disarm the alarm so I could grab it. When I went in I quickly ran to the room I left it, and when I picked it up and crouched down to the height of a child I heard a whisper in my ear as clearly as if someone was there. After a year or so and some research through a friend at the town hall I found documentation of a 4-year-old girl who was killed in the building in 1890 due to a crate falling on her. Maybe I was going crazy, who knows. Copied from earlier comment I made, it happened about 10 years ago, but I will never forget it. I think about it a lot. To understand, the layout of my room was that you would open the bedroom door and there will be a small office space, then a narrow hallway, then the actual bedroom, all behind that one door. There was an octagonal window right above the hallway, and the light switch to the hallway was right under the window. It was around 8 at night, and I was going upstairs to my bedroom. I opened the door and I instantly noticed that there was sort of an oval-shaped area of darkness in front of where the light switch would be. This area shape was an opaque level of black compared to the darkness in the room. I remember thinking to myself that it was probably just some weird lighting coming through the octagonal window. I walked across the room to get to the light switch, and just as I had reached the area where the oval area of darkness was, it suddenly felt like I wasn't there anymore. I can't really explain it. I can only explain how I felt, and I couldn't see anything. All I could see was pitch black, and for some reason it just felt like this blackness stretched infinitely in all directions and I was alone in it, that I wasn't in my room anymore for some reason. I started to swing my arms around wildly and I hit my arm on the wall and scrambled to feel the light switch, and I turned it on. I didn't feel scared after that because whatever that feeling was, I knew it wasn't going to be there anymore. That's the only time that has ever happened in my life, but I think about it a lot because the feeling was so intense. The previous owner of the house that my dad lives in died in the basement. He was working on his treadmill, had a heart attack, and his wife found him. Ever since my dad moved in, weird shit has been happening. Cabinets opening and closing by themselves, things being moved, etc. One night, my girlfriend, our friend, and I were in the basement hanging out at the bar down there and just talking. My dad yelled down the stairs that he was running down to the neighbors for a bit, and we heard him fire up his ATV and take off. About 5 minutes later, we hear the screen door open, someone walk into the house, to the kitchen, back to my dad's bedroom, and walk back up to the kitchen. It seemed kind of odd because none of us heard the ATV pull up to the house. I immediately went upstairs to see who was there, and there was nobody. I checked the whole house. I thought that someone maybe snuck in and then back out, but my girlfriend and our friend both said they didn't hear any more footsteps when I went up to look. That happened 2 years ago and it still gives me chills thinking about it. Years ago I was staying at a flat my friend lived in. It was a typical old house for here. Maybe like 80 years or so. I go one night to get a drink of water and suddenly I feel chilled. Like a presence was in the room with me, but it was night and everyone was asleep. I was too scared to look up and just focused on my glass of water and went back to bed. Morning I asked the long-term tenant about any spooky things that happened at the house. She just goes, kitchen or outside laundry? And said many people had reported feeling it and that the old lady stubbornly stayed well beyond her ability to care for herself and died in the house not wanting to leave. Creepy as hell. Never forgot it. I had a dream of being in an old house with a girl a bit younger than me with pale skin and black hair. I got haunting feelings like being a cemetery and accepting death. I was going to move into my mother's house, but the room, which was empty, felt overwhelmingly depressing. I legitimately felt somebody hung themselves there. The stairs and top floor were always off. I felt like I was being watched when near the stairs. Months later, the furnace messed up and burned a hole to the top floor, causing smoke damage in minor. Surprise, surprise, the room I was supposed to be in and right near where the bed would have been. No idea who lives there now. I used to work overnights and got home late that morning, so it was about noon when I was finally getting into bed. I had one knee up on my bed to get in and I hear the garage door open and loud steps stomping up the stairs and clomping down the hallway and into my brother's room. I was in the basement, his room was directly over mine. Furious at his loud, I went flying up the stairs to tell him to STFU. As I'm walking down the hallway I hear voices and noises coming from his room. Even more pissed off, I quicken my pace and storm around the corner and down the hallway. The bedrooms were off, L-shaped hallway. Bursting into his room, mouth already spewing obscenities, only to find nobody there. The voices and noises stopped, no electronics were on, so no music or TV. To explain what I'd heard, I scampered back down to the basement and slept with the light on even though it was broad daylight. I grew up living on 175 acres of a mountain. One night I was home alone. While watching TV I saw a shadow from the ceiling lights start to flicker. I looked at it and it stopped, so I kept watching TV. It started moving again. I thought maybe it was from the light off the TV, but the ceiling light was on, so there shouldn't be any shadows. I look up again and it stops. This time I go back to watching TV, and when it starts moving again I moved my eyes to look without moving my head. Sure enough, the shadow was wiggling/flickering like I thought I saw. I then turned my head and witnessed it actually stop. Pretty much scared the crap out of teenage me, so I called my dad in a panic. I hastily tell him what happened, to which he replies by laughing at me. "You found like your mom." "Mom. I'll call Mom." Turns out when I was a child she saw a shadow and light go down the hallway, and when she came around the corner it was looking over my crib. She said it was my guardian angel. When I moved out of my parents' house I took my great-grandmother's clock with me, as it had been one of the things I wanted after my grandmother passed away. It's an Art Deco mantelpiece clock. It would chime on the quarter hour if it worked, but it needs to be fully cleaned and properly wound, and I've never gotten around to taking it to a specialist to get this done. On the day I moved, I took it to the new place in the car, gently nestled in a bunch of sheets and blankets, put it on top of a shelf, and continued with unpacking and whatnot. Late that afternoon, it rang a full-hour chime, and then fell silent. My sister and my friend were with me in the bedroom unpacking my shoes and clothes, and no one was near it. We all kind of stopped and stared at each other. It has never made any chime since that time. I wondered if the car could have jiggled it, but you need a key to wind it, and my parents didn't drop that to me until a month after I moved. It kind of felt like my relatives were telling me they approved of my new place, which was really nice. My best friend died August 1st. I became extremely ill and was near death in the hospital with toxemia 3 weeks later. On the morning of August 23rd, I saw my friend and felt her hug me and encouraging me to stay strong. My mom walked in 5 minutes later. My daughter was born shortly thereafter. I don't really believe in this stuff, but this one is an exception. We had to put my old lady doggo to sleep last June. Her name was Honey. She died on the Monday. On Wednesday, my dad said that digging her grave had killed his back. We went to KFC to find our heavy garden umbrella blown over. It wasn't that windy, or at least it hadn't been all day. I jokingly said, "Honey, chill." The wind died down. That night, it was lashing out of the heavens. I didn't want Honey getting wet, so I was contemplating putting my dad's golfing umbrella over her grave. My cousin randomly arrives, and offers to place the umbrella for me. It stops raining. When speaking to Honey, I would say, "Blow the wind, Baba," or say something the wind would blow. I put it down to coincidence, but then this happened. I was at Honey's grave, crying, when on a whim I looked up at the sky and half-jokingly said, "Honey, twinkle a star." Before I could finish my sentence, a shooting star shot across the sky. I bawled my eyes out. We had to move house last week, so Baba is back at our old home, haunting the new owners, hopefully. I miss her. Her picture is next to my bed. She will forever be buried in my heart. I love you so much, Baba. I was 7 and had a dream in which I was watching a younger relative of mine, but only narrowly. I wasn't sure why my vision was skewed. He was in his bedroom putting a tape into the VHS, which he was not allowed to do without help because he was too young. My first instinct was to tell on him. Then I woke up. Next day, I'm putzing around at my grandma's house and notice that my younger relative is acting strange. I follow until I'm outside his room, and I peep through a narrow crack in the door and see him putting a tape into the VHS. Before he notices I'm spying, I decide to tell on him. As I'm running to Grandma, it occurs to me that this was exactly what I saw in my dream. My parents and family went through the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. My grandfather, a congressman, was one of the first to be targeted by the Khmer Rouge regime. He was taken away from my family in the first days of the takeover. While my family was being pushed out of the city, they took refuge in a hut. My eldest and, the oldest daughter, saw him in a dream. He was riding an elephant, like Ganesh, and he came to her to say goodbye. In form we believe that night he died, but he also explicitly warned her to get out of the hut. Like, in plain language, get everyone out of the hut. She awoke and made everyone pack up and get out of the hut. 2 minutes later, mortar bombs fell from the sky and exploded the huts and their surroundings. This is a true story, no embellishments. When my grandmother passed away recently, she also visited my eldest aunt in a dream the night of. Can't really explain these things, you know? I will say, I've had my most paranormal experiences out in Southeast Asia. Very rarely in the West, if at all. My best friend in high school, Kate, lived in what I'm pretty sure was a haunted house. One night, my friend Jane and I were staying over at Kate's place. We get settled in bed, all 3 of us smushed in Kate's bed, and we're still goofing around, giggling and talking. Suddenly we see a flash of light at the foot of her bed, which was right by the door to her room, which was closed. We started yelling, playfully, at her little sister Beth, because we assumed she had hidden in the room somehow and waited till we turned off the lights to freak us out. But she opened the door from the hallway and was super annoyed that we'd interrupted her book/movie/whatever. We have no idea what caused that flash. Same night, about 30 minutes later we've calmed down a little and we're back to talking about boys or whatever. I'm laying there looking at the ceiling listening to one of them tell a story. Kate's computer was on her floor under her desk, and had a bright blue light that cast a shadow of her desk chair onto her ceiling. I'm laying there and see the shadow of the chair legitimately turn on its own, as if someone was sitting in it and turned from facing the monitor to facing her bed. We all screamed and ran into her mom's room and slept there that night. I had another experience when they were packing up to move into a new house. I stayed over and Kate had to get up early to go pick up some boxes from the grocery store. Her parents were both off somewhere, I think at work, and her sister Beth was at a friend's. I decided to sleep in and stay in the house alone, because Kate was only supposed to be gone for about 20 minutes. I'm laying there in her room after she leaves and I suddenly smell men's cologne. For the record, her dad didn't wear cologne much, and he wasn't home. I then hear footsteps, which sound like men's work boots, very heavy and slow. I got freaked out and turned on her TV and didn't go back to sleep. I was so glad when they moved. My family was pretty sensitive about this stuff. Living in Southeast Asia, our ghosts are more apparent and not just orbs and sounds. Our family house was pretty haunted, as I was told that it was located strategically in the middle of the Spirit Road. So there's lots of sightings, sounds etc. I've mostly seen old guys, young ladies and black cat being scratched, whispered, and touched were fairly frequent occasions. When the haunting is at its peak, around 1998 to 2001, I have experienced meeting spirits/ghosts that looks like my dad and take me to the forest. Luckily I've realized that I've went far away that the usual route my dad usually took me, and when he knows that I knows, he turned his head 180 degrees, smiled and then I got out there. Meet him couple more times later but none as scared as the first one. The old record player going on over and over, the shadow people walking through the house, the voices of conversation between a man and a woman. We could never understand what they were saying. My bed shaking, things going missing then turning up in obvious places 3 hours, 3 months later, and, that's just the house I grew up in. I've had a few that people could attribute to the paranormal, however I'm not really sold. Apparently I was a pretty freaky kid, used to mention my other mother before I came to my mom. Apparently she was a bit of a BTCH and I didn't like her. When I was 3 or so my gran went to my granddad's grave and asked for him to watch over me. Pretty much from the next day I started talking about the man who came through the door, and pointed to a blank bit of wall, in my room and how he used to sit with me and talk. Fast forward to 2015 and my gran was seriously ill in hospital having had a stroke. She'd pass away a month later. On one visit she was asking me why my dad wasn't coming over to speak to her. He died the year before. I asked her what she meant. She pointed to a corner of the hospital saying how he was standing just over there. Next time I visited her she said she was disappointed my dad hadn't come with us this time. There were a couple more times after this she mentioned how my dad was there. I chalked them up to the overactive imagination of a 3-year-old and the visual hallucinations of a seriously ill woman. But I would be lying if I said they didn't give me a little bit of a chill. My grandma always fed the squirrels in her yard. Random scraps usually. Sometimes an ear of dry corn in the feeder just for them. She developed leukemia and passed very quickly. It was 2 weeks from diagnosis to the day she passed. The following spring the neighbor noticed none of her tulips had bloomed. Then she realized they were blooming in my grandma's garden. We like to think the squirrels were paying homage to my grandma with flowers. After she passed I'd just gotten out of a relationship and was really sick of dating. Said a prayer to her. Since she and Grandpa were married 53 years before he passed, 54 when she did 11 months later. And I asked her, could you please send me my soulmate so I can have a long happy marriage like you two had? About a week later I start talking to a guy online. We end up dating and got married in October 2016. Grandma Bunny really threw a curveball though, with my soulmate being an Eskimo IT guy. I'm from Illinois, but now we live in his hometown in the Alaskan bush and are very happy together. Even have 3 cat babies. I grew up on the divorced parents, see dad every other weekend routine. When I was 7, I slept on the couch that faced my dad's bedroom which was open and I couldn't sleep. With the blanket up over my nose, I opened my eyes and looked over at the doorway, and terror swirled through my entire body as a tall, slender black figure stood in the doorway. Paralyzed by pure fear, I didn't say a word. I just stared into the darkness. It was like a black smudge among the darkened home, standing out from normal darkness, and after what felt like an eternity, my dad called out, "Quit messing around, go back to sleep." The comfort of his voice gave me the courage to shout back, "Dad, I'm still on the couch." He must have heard the crackling, terror in my voice, and flipped his nightstand light on. It was gone, just disappeared with the light. He told me he heard a swishing sound like someone sneaking around in the dark. I explained what I saw. He dismissed it as shadows playing tricks, and we watched infomercials, Billy Mays here, until I fell asleep and he went back to his room. Fast forward to being 13, Dad remarried and I helped him move out, and as we sat in the nearly empty house, I asked him if he remembered the incident. He did, and he decided to disclose some vital information. The previous owner died of a heart attack in the living room, and off and on for years he experienced quirky noises, shadowy figures, and odd dreams. He chalked it up to working long hours, little sleep, and living alone. He didn't want me, with a self-admitted colorful imagination, to be afraid to stay with him. I moved around quite a bit in my childhood and experienced some strange things, but I've rationalized it as being an only child, strong imagination, watching way too many ghost shows, and the eventual acceptance of suffering sleep paralysis/night terrors. Door shutting in attic with footsteps walking across the floor and coming down the steps. Scared the hell out of me. So many others, also. My house is haunted. So before this happened, I was your semi-traditional atheist, Buddhist upbringing, with a standard secular worldview. I had always told every religious/spiritual person that I had a debate with that I would change views if evidence came along. LST, I got a chance to live up to that statement recently. About 4 months ago, I was meditating. To set the scene, I was alone in my room at night, but with other people in the house. Things were going smoothly before I started convulsing, possibly catatonia, get back to this later, and hearing a voice speaking to me. Horrible stuff, and I was crying by the end of it. I also saw, more like a vision, something sitting on the end of my bed in the shape of a black humanoid thing. After it was over, I looked into the mirror and saw that I was bleeding out of my nose, Stranger Things style. I decided in that moment to try and repeat the results. I made a small experiment and repeated the conditions from the night before, put on same background music and lighting. Lo and behold, it happened again, although with fewer convulsions. I did this a third time, for certainty reasons, and it occurred again a third time. I figured that it was extremely unlikely for me to bleed 3 times in a row with only mental stimuli without some sort of outside force. I don't have allergies or have frequent bloody nose issues either. This is when I decided that either there was some other being out there speaking to me, or that I was crazy. Keep in mind, I was logging all of this down in a notebook, more on this later. After all of this, I went to my friend who happened to be a witch, or at least believed that she was sincerely. I told her about all of the above, and she gave me some advice. After this, I began to be contacted by this thing more frequently, verbal communication mostly, more on this later. This went on for about 2 weeks before I really started to break down. It told me to kill people, commit suicide, but mostly not to trust my witch friend at all. Again, more on this later. Eventually, I realized that I was at huge risk from either a dangerous spirit, I still hate using the term, or severe mental illness. Not a pleasant choice. I went to my witch friend on how to get rid of this thing, and she gave me advice on how to purge it. I followed her instruction, which involved concentrated meditation and focuses on an expanding internal ball of light. Things went swimmingly up until the end, at which point the spirit/demon/hallucination screamed and triggered a panic attack. Yay! I freaked out and broke down. The next day, I got a bracelet thingy for my friend and a bunch of quartz crystals from a teacher, probably/definitely placebos, but appreciated, and endeavored to try again. I meditated almost to the point of completion, and it screamed. I was able to overpower it however and purge whatever was left. 2 days after, I went and did a reading. I internally shudder at that word, brings to mind my gullible aunt, with my witch friend, and came up clean. Unfortunately, some of this didn't stop. I continued seeing things, new things. Tentacled monsters, what looked like no face from Spirited Away, swarms of insects, pleasant stuff. It was then that I realized that I had a mental illness. I know this thread was about things that could have only been explained by the paranormal, but at the time, it was the only valid explanation I could come up with. Flash forward to now, and I've become a strange case. I display some symptoms of schizophrenia, hallucinations, catatonia, but not others, disorganized speech, thought block, and as a result, the professionals I'm working with still can't figure out what's wrong with me. As for this, I have 3 options to what actually happened to me. I'm crazy and I have been crazy this entire time. The likely option, I actually did encounter a spirit and went crazy as a result. The Lovecraft protagonist option, I encountered a spirit and got witch sight as a result. The coolest option in my opinion, also the one suggested by my teacher. In any of these cases, I still view this as not an entirely negative experience. I get street cred with my friends in the Oppression game. I now have a bunch of new D&D monster designs, and can actually realistically portray mentally ill characters. The downside is being crazy, but who really cares, /s. When I was in high school, I was alone in my bedroom playing video games one night. I finished playing, got up, and when I went to open my door handle, it started aggressively jiggling by itself. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I confirmed that there was absolutely nobody home and the dog and cat were sound asleep downstairs. There was no earthquake or anything like that. I ran outside and waited until my parents came home. I'm not really a believer in the supernatural, but what the hell? I have no clue what that was. Nothing like it ever happened again. When I was 21, I was gonna go to the bathroom before going to bed. A computer monitor was the only light I had and I turned it off before walking out of the room. When I opened my door I heard what sounded like pacing at the end of the hall, only it sounded like the step was heavy enough to cause the floor to creak, which I had never heard in this house before. I felt nervous and listened and thought somebody must be sleepwalking or something and I'd deal with it, so I turned the corner, but my vision went pure white and all the sound went away. I froze. I know it wasn't actually light because it wasn't blinding or painful to look at, it was just that all I saw was white. I don't actually remember thinking anything, but after what felt like maybe 5 seconds went by, I pulled myself back towards my door and everything came back. I could hear again. It was night, and the sound at the end of the hall was gone. I immediately ran and turned the lights on and waited and listened. It was quiet. I eventually peed. I was terrified of the dark for like 3 to 4 years after that. I actually slept with the light on for a couple months. When I started turning the light off again, I basically refused to open my eyes or look around the room until morning. It really scared me and I don't know why. I eventually forced myself through exposure therapy of thinking about that night in the dark and seeing nothing bad was happening to get past my fear. Initially, when I thought about it, my body would shake from the fear and adrenaline. I have no explanation for what happened. I had a friend I told say it must have been a dream. It wasn't a dream. I was sober and awake, and that was real enough that it affected me for several years. I'm over it now, but I still wonder what I saw sometimes. My house was built in 1880s, so we have some weird things that happen that we just brush off as weird. The only one I can say for sure was paranormal actually happened with our truck. To note, we only have one set of keys for our truck, so we keep them in our house on our key hook. Get home from work and every light is on in our truck: headlights, reverse and brake lights, dome lights, etc. We go to see if anyone tried to break into or hotwire it. Nothing, still locked, just will all the lights on. Once they turn off, try to see if you pull the handle when locked if the lights turn on. Nothing. Found out when you hit the lock button on the keyring it turns off all the lights. Keys were in the house the entire time, kinda more of a fun one. My fiancé asked me to turn on the Xbox once and it turned on by itself. I looked to see if the controller was on, since that's how I usually turn it on. Nope, controller is off. Asked my fiancé how he turned on the Xbox with his phone. He has the Xbox app, so he sometimes will send message through it, and he said he didn't. Our explanation was that something must have been starting to update and our Xbox will randomly turn on when that happens. So we just had incredible timing. I still wonder though. My grandma always fed the squirrels in her yard. Random scraps usually, sometimes an ear of dry corn in the feeder just for them. She developed leukemia and passed very quickly. It was 2 weeks from diagnosis to the day she passed. The following spring the neighbor noticed none of her tulips had bloomed. Then she realized they were blooming in my grandma's garden. We like to think the squirrels were paying homage to my grandma with flowers. After she passed, I'd just gotten out of a relationship and was really sick of dating. Said a prayer to her, since she and Grandpa were married 53 years before he passed, 54 when she did 11 months later. And I asked her, could you please send me my soulmate so I can have a long happy marriage like you two had? About a week later I start talking to a guy online. We end up dating and got married in October 2016. Grandma Bunny really threw a curveball though, with my soulmate being an Eskimo IT guy. I'm from Illinois, but now we live in his hometown in the Alaskan bush and are very happy together. Even have 3 cat babies. My friend's dad built a rocking chair, and it was the type of chair that he wouldn't let anyone sit in, even his wife. He passed away a few years ago and my friend said the chair would sometimes randomly start rocking. I didn't really believe him. No one in the family sat in the chair after his passing, but one night I was over for dinner and the mother/widow went to sit down in the chair, and right before her butt touched the seat the whole thing fell apart. In the blink of an eye all the wooden screw just fell apart and fell to the ground. She ended up falling onto the mess with food all over her. All of us were completely stunned, no other explanation. Around the beginning of December, I started having a feeling of dread that was attached to my friend's mother, whom I have never met. My relationship with this friend is a bit strange. We've known each other for 17 years. We're sometimes lovers, sometimes friends, and we can go years without contact and just pick up again. We have a strong connection, but neither of us has included our families or friends in our relationship. I had wanted to text him to ask about his mother but didn't want him to think I was crazy. Finally, I called because the feeling of dread was very strong. He texted me back 5 minutes later that he was in Texas. His mom had had a massive heart attack. She's 89 or 90, so it's amazing that she survived. He called me last week to let me know that she had turned a corner and they were planning to move her to rehab. I haven't heard from him since then. The feeling of dread never went away, even after they said she would recover. I think she's going to die. This happened a few times when I was younger, and no matter how much I try to find a rational explanation that fits everything, I can't. My family used to live in a little terraced house. It used to be a 2-bedroom, but the upstairs bathroom was converted into a 3rd bedroom, and the bathroom was moved to an extension out the back. The way the houses were laid out was mirrored, so our stairs shared a wall with the neighbor's stairs, and the front room next to the stairs shared a wall with the front room of the neighbors on the other side. The stairs had 14 steps, with a corner at the top that lead to a landing that was just a square big enough for a door on the other 3 sides. Occasionally, I'd wake at some point after midnight. I think it was around 2 or 3 a.m., although I always ended up so scared that I'd lie so motionless that I couldn't look at the time. From nowhere, there'd be footsteps coming up the stairs. Heavy footsteps, like someone wearing work boots. I could hear the footfalls and the creaking of steps that creaked. There wouldn't have been footsteps in the downstairs hall, and the front door at the bottom of the stairs hadn't opened. They'd start on the first step, and walk up 14 steps to the landing. Then, they'd step over to each door and turn, starting on the left with my sister's room, then over to mine, and then to my parents' room on the right. All the doors would be closed at night, and there was no way to open them without the hinges creaking, or my sister's sliding door rumbling along the runners. And that would be it. There'd be no footsteps going back down the stairs, none of the bedroom doors would open, they just reached the tiny landing and stopped. I mentioned earlier that the stairs shared a wall with the neighbor's stairs, but the stairs themselves weren't connected, so the neighbor going up their stairs wouldn't have caused ours to creak. And I'm absolutely certain that the footsteps outside the doors were on our landing. Nothing bad ever came of it, but I was never able to explain it. My mother also mentioned hearing footsteps at night, on occasions, but she never used to like talking about it. I'm pretty damn skeptical, but this I just can't explain, as both me and my 10-year-old son saw it. Me, my husband at the time, and our 3 children drove to the supermarket. My husband just needed to pop in for something quick, but my 2 daughters wanted to go in with him, so me and my son sat in the car waiting, just talking, etc. We then see my ex come out the shop, walk past the car and continue down the footpath. My son says, "Where's the girls?" I'm thinking the same thing, so look back at the supermarket only to see my ex and my daughters exiting. Me and my son were shocked. He says, "But we just saw Dad come out. There's absolutely no way it could have been someone who looked similar, as my ex is a below-knee amputee and very distinctive looking. You just can't confuse him with someone else." So yeah, both me and my son saw my ex's doppelganger at the same time. My childhood house was built on top of an old water well which the builders had to fill in before they started the construction. Looked similar to the one from The Ring. I lived in this house from when I was 7 until I was 17 and experienced a number of things that I still cannot explain. I never found any evidence of deaths or any accidents that happened on the property, but there were a few places in the house that would feel cold or I'd get the feeling I was being watched. My mom always said to me that she thought our house was easily accessible by spirits who passed on. One of the most memorable experiences I had was shared with both of my parents and my brother. It was about midnight and my brother was turning 9 years old that morning. I was 14 at the time and was in bed when I woke up to a beeping sound coming from the hallway. My parents kept a carbon monoxide detector plugged into the hallway that connected all our bedrooms, and when I walked out of my room, my parents and brother were already standing around it as it was beeping. This detector was only made to beep a single tone to alert for carbon monoxide, but instead it was beeping the notes to Happy Birthday. It only lasted a few seconds, but we all heard it and wondered how this could be possible. My dad even went so far as to test the detector the next day and take it apart to see if it could beep in multiple pitches again. When he did this, he could only get it to beep in the one tone that it was supposed to do. I always wonder who wanted to wish my brother a happy birthday that night, because whoever it was sure got the message through. Besides that occurrence, myself and my family all have multiple stories of experiences in that house that none of us can explain. To name a few things, I've seen shadows and people who weren't there, heard my mom's voice calling my name when she wasn't home, and I used to sleepwalk to certain places in the house in the middle of the night. Looking out the kitchen window was my body's favorite place to wake me up. After I moved out of that house, my family and I haven't experienced anything like the things we went through for the 10 years we lived there. Standing in the kitchen in my parents' house loading the dishwasher and I drop a fork. I swear pretty loud and freak out because out of the corner of my eye I saw what I thought was my dad walking in, as it was a dark shape about his size. I turn and there's nothing there and I just freeze for a solid minute staring at the doorway before I finally move again. To this day that's the creepiest thing I've ever had happen to me. My university has a set of movable stacks in the basement of one of their libraries. You turn a wheel at the head of the stacks to move it slowly on a set of rails. The policy is if you're using the stacks you leave your backpack under the wheel of the aisle you're in to let others know you're there and they don't crush you accidentally. I did this and looked for my book. As I'm looking, the stack starts moving toward me. I'm annoyed since my bag is clearly there and it's a white floor. There is no way you could miss it. I shout towards the front of the stacks, but the stack is still slowly moving towards me. I start walking towards the front of the stack, shouting and banging on the shelf as I go, and it is still closing in on me. I even banged on the bare metal part where you put unshelved books. The stack didn't even slow down. When I'm about 3 feet from the opening, the stack is practically pressing against my chest. I make a last-ditch attempt and push some books off the shelf into the opposite aisle. The stack finally stops. I have to slide out of the aisle, but I keep my eye on the front of the aisle and I try to look through the spaces between the books to see if I can catch the idiot who almost killed me. I don't see anything, any movement, or hear any sound other than my own heartbeat. At the head of the stacks I can see that nothing is disturbed, other than the books I pushed onto the floor. My bag is still where I left it. Suddenly the adrenaline rush leaves me and I crash. My arms and legs shake so hard I can barely stand straight. I feel like I am about to cry and throw up at the same time. I take a few breaths and a drink from my water bottle, then I just leave the library. I went back for the book only when I absolutely need it. Some backstory: my mother was raised by her aunt as her mom passed away when she was 3. There was years and years of emotional and physical abuse by said aunt, and one of the ways she would control my mother was by making sure she was the only mom she ever knew. This included keeping family photos and heirlooms away from my mother. As a result, I have very rarely seen family photos from before I was born. Now for as long as I can remember I have dreamt of this man. He always looks the same and never says anything. He's just been a steady character in my dreams. In dreams with lots of people, he'll be the only one in a crowd I can focus on. If I dream something scary, he's there and I can pull myself awake after seeing him, etc. I always thought he was my safe zone I created somehow. My grandmother moved away to another town when I was 21 and my mother was finally given a bunch of photo albums. She was excited to show me pictures of her biological mother. One photo was a bunch of people sitting at a long table looking at the camera, and right at the front is the man from my dreams. Same plaid button-up, pens in his pocket and a cardigan over top. Same silent smirk like he's about to say something. And so I asked my mother who he is. He is her grandfather. He died right before she got pregnant with me and she was one of his favorites. I begin to tell her about him being in my dreams, kind of looking out for me, and how he never speaks, just watches. She says he was very much like that in real life and can't believe what I'm telling her. I'm now 24 and pregnant with my second son. This pregnancy has been rough emotionally for me as I became a single mother at 5 months pregnant and have a 2-year-old as well. One night after tossing and turning to get to sleep, I start dreaming my 2-year-old is dead. I keep picking him up from his bed and can feel how cold and heavy he is, except every time I try to leave his room I am transported right back to the moment I find him and pick him up again. I know I'm dreaming, but I cannot get out of this horrifying loop. I suddenly hear someone loudly and sternly shout, "Mordsith, wake up. He's fine." And I jump awake. There standing in my doorway is the man. My great-grandfather, just standing with his plaid shirt, cardigan and pens in his pocket. At this point I'm bawling, so I assume it's just my uncle who lives upstairs. I wipe my eyes and look again. He is still there, smiles and walks away into the hallway. I'm dumbfounded and jump out of bed, flick on all lights and cannot find anyone in my house. After I check on my 2-year-old I go upstairs to check on my uncle, still convinced it was him. He was asleep and the whole house is dark. It could only be a paranormal experience and one of the only times I have seen a full-body apparition instead of shadows or orbs in my life. I was rocking my baby to sleep in the rocking chair 5 years ago. She fell asleep, so I got up and did my little shimmy in a circle to make sure she was really asleep before I put her down on the bed. When I turned back around, there was a golden brown figure of a young man standing 2 feet from me, watching me. As I made eye contact, his face turned to a look of surprise that he had been spotted, and then he disappeared. It was amazing. I wasn't even scared to put my daughter to bed and leave the room. I got up one day at about 3 a.m. to go pee, and left my door open but the light off. When I walked back to my room, I got to the doorway and had to stop. There was a thing. The best description is Gollum, but a shadow, small, creepy, unnatural, and overall not something you want to see standing next to your bed at night. I only saw it for a split second before my brain said, "You do not want to be here, go away," and I decided I really needed to go to the kitchen and get some water. I dithered for about 5 minutes and then went back to find my room blissfully empty. The only thing was that the book I had left on my pillow had been knocked to the floor. I've tried to convince myself that it was our black cat just looking for someone to sleep with, but I also know for a fact that that cat was locked in with my parents for the night and could not have gotten into my room. My dad died in an accident which obviously shook our family to the core. I wasn't coping too well and he came back often to reassure me. To pick just a couple of incidents, a few days after he died I was home alone and sitting on the toilet. I heard my dad walking towards the bathroom. His motorcycle boots were very heavy and I knew the sound of his steps. I quickly closed the door, finished my business, and then thought, wait. Dad's not here anymore. I looked under the door and saw a shadow. There was definitely someone standing there. I waited a while, unsure of what was happening, before I was like, you know what? I'd love to see Dad. I opened the door and, while Dad wasn't there, his boots were right in the way of the door and I tripped over them. Don't know how they got there, but I knew Dad was proud of himself. I was upstairs in my room just minding my own business. A few weeks after his death, my dad had a real particular way of saying my name. It was short and sharp. No one else says my name the way my dad did. Anyway, it was quiet in the house when I heard my dad calling out to me. I would have thought it was my imagination, but my dog looked up towards the door. She definitely heard him too. I raced downstairs and asked my mom if she'd heard him, to which she said he didn't. Weird shit happened for months after he died. I know it was my dad messing with me, and I wish it had continued forever. Actually, I have had several paranormal experiences. One of the more minor ones concerned a tray of war for Southern independence, the so-called American Civil War, relics I had on display on my mantle. They were amongst the first I ever recovered, and came from one of the very first but very crucial battles of the war, the Battle of Rich Mountain, near Beverly, West Virginia. Then in 1861, still the state of Virginia, I was standing in my kitchen and was looking directly at the little framed objects when, without any warning whatsoever, the case flipped forward and crashed down onto my hearth, breaking the glass. The display didn't slip bottom first, but like someone flipped the top of display forward with their fingers. I stood and watched it happen. This was one of the more minor experiences, and though I haven't seen an apparition, I have heard and seen evidence of their presence. Not scary like some, but paranormal as in Sixth Sense. About 10 years ago I moved into a tiny one-bedroom rental apartment in the basement of an older farmhouse. It was kind of a shithole, technically a studio with a den, as the bedroom didn't have any windows. I lived there for about 6 months and then moved into the main house when those tenants moved out. The thing is, I never slept in the bedroom. Not once. I had all my clothes in the closet. I set up my very comfy bed. And I love to sleep in very dark rooms. But I slept on my sofa every single night. I got a dog, and she shared the sofa with me. It was not a really comfy sofa. I wasn't sure why. There was nothing wrong with that room. But I just had a really uncomfortable vibe when I was in there. Not scary, not overwhelming feeling of something evil. Had that in my house growing up. But I couldn't stay in that room for longer than getting changed in the morning. After I moved upstairs, I was talking with the landlord's son and he mentioned that the previous tenant, this old hippie who had lived there for years, died in the bedroom. Just a peaceful, died in his sleep thing. I just feel that I had picked up on that. I can't explain why I would avoid that room so strongly and choose to sleep on my uncomfortable sofa for 6 months for any other reason. I was living in a place with an ex-girlfriend and a housemate. There were 3 instances I can remember. The first was seeing someone and I thought it was the housemate, only to realize they just walked through an unopened door. The second, I was in the kitchen making food. This kitchen was rather small and there wasn't much in the way of bench space, so I had invested in one of those portable kitchen island benches. I had 2 bowls on this island bench and was using the bench next to the sink to cut stuff up on. I remember cleaning the knife and putting it on the island bench between the bowls while I was grabbing and organizing ingredients. I reached back for the knife and it wasn't there. I didn't think much of it. My memory is bad, so maybe I had put it away and forgot about it. I grabbed another knife and continued prepping food, and I went to put this knife where I thought I'd put the other one. Lo and behold, the original knife is back where I had put it. The third time, I hear the front door open and heavy footsteps coming up the steps. Sounds exactly like my housemate, so I call out a greeting. I only get silence. I go check, and no one was there. It was still an hour before my housemate got home from work. We lived really close to a hospital, and the housemate thinks a few souls who have passed on get confused and go wandering. This was 12 years ago. I was 14. My friend and I were quickly going through her house gathering clothes while my mom waited in the car for us outside. That night there was a school dance and the theme was the red carpet. It was right around Halloween, so costumes were encouraged, and clever us decided we would go as hippies protesting the red carpet. We went through her mom and sister's room for hippie clothes, then went into my friend's room to try them on. I noticed a device that kind of looked like a cell phone sitting on her desk. "That's a really small cell phone," I said. "Oh, that's a digital recorder," she replied. "Here, let me show you how it works." She picked it up, held the button down, and, as a joke, said, "Who are you?" into the speaker. She held the recorder out, but our smiles faded when the little red lights started flashing. This of course meant that the recorder was picking up a voice. We play the recording back. It was a choking sound followed by a loud moan. It sounded like a woman. We turned to each other and screamed. We booked it back to my mom's car and were freaking out. We play it back to my mom and I think she thought we were making it up because she didn't seem to really care. We bring it to the school dance. I think the next night was our orchestra retreat. We were both in orchestra together, and we brought it there, too, and showed it to everyone. Lots of people didn't believe us. A few did, her mom included, and were really creeped out. My friend went on to tell me that in the past, she had seen things in her house. One time she was sitting on the couch, and the lights were on. She was facing a window and since it was dark, she could see her reflection. She said she saw a man behind her, trying to peer over her shoulder to look at her face. When she looked over, nothing was there. In another instance, she saw a man in her yard walk by. He turned the corner and she looked out the window and he was gone. But her yard was fenced in. I think the fence was at least 6 feet, and there was no door or gate in the area he was walking towards. A few weeks later, she accidentally recorded over the creepy ghost moan. It's lost forever, but I will always remember that shit, and how unexplainable it was and still is. By the time we were seniors, my friend had moved in with her older boyfriend in a different city, still attended my school though, occasionally, was a massive crusty punk, hardcore vegan, Worked on a farm/vegan kitchen, etc. etc. It seemed like she was really into the crusty punk lifestyle, and I kind of wonder if she was homeless. She seemed like a totally different person than the nice, innocent kid I met in 9th grade. Now I can't find any trace of her. I see her mom and sister occasionally, around town and whatnot, but never her. Kinda sad. I felt like she got into the wrong crowd and is now estranged from them. Anyway, I guess it's not that exciting of a story. I actively try to avoid any ghostly situations because I'm so scared of them, but with this particular one there was no avoiding. I've posted this before. I was sitting in my room listening to music and the volume kept turning down. I turned it back up. The third time it happened I heard a loud sigh and it went down again. A few weeks later my brother threw a cricket bat at me and it made a hole in the wall. Inside the hole was a pair of old lady stockings tied around a clump of hair. We freaked out. We had to put a poster over the hole in the wall so Dad didn't lose his mind, so we didn't tell anyone. Freaky, and my brother was only about 8, so no, he wasn't messing with me. I was haunted by a voodoo grandma who hated Duran Duran. When I was 15 to 16, I was in the house alone and heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I was certain someone was breaking into the house, so I grabbed my hunting knife and headed down to check things out. After finding the sliding door and windows intact, I looked in the bathroom and found the potpourri dish my mom kept on top of the toilet broken on the floor. There's no way it could have even fallen, but the distribution of the fragments implied that it was thrown against the far wall. All the doors were locked, no way for anyone to have entered. Okay, time to dive into my teenage years. One night, I was reading on my computer in my room. Now my room had 2 mirrors. A long, dollar store mirror on the wall beside me and the double doors to my closet were also mirrors, so not a lot of wall space for a shadow as they were on walls facing each other. On this night, I look over at the mirror beside me, and see a fully formed, shadow figure looking over my shoulder. I refused to spend more than a minute in that room for weeks. We moved into our house when I was 12. I got a room in the basement because I was an angst-ridden teen, and didn't care that it had the door to the closet under the stairs in it. I always felt like something was in there watching whenever I helped Mom move stuff in and out of it. Plus it would randomly open up while no one was in the room or I was sleeping. Had a friend wake up when sleeping over to see it happen and see 2 eyes staring at her. That winter I had my dad die when I was 13. Tragic winter storm car accident. The door stopped opening and shutting after that, so Mom and I like to joke that he chased the thing off and takes care of the house now. I was like 13 in my room at midnight on summer break. I was on Xbox Live with all my friends and my buddy says something like he has to get off because he has church tomorrow. So as we were playing rounds of Infected? Can't remember the name. Sitting in the Halo 3 lobby I respond God isn't real and my Xbox turns off and red rings of death appear. RIP Xbox. Not a religious dude but I was shook. I dowsed once, when I was 15 or 16 years old. I was already pretty skeptical of the supernatural or paranormal, and didn't believe dowsing was a thing, but my maternal grandfather was into that kind of thing, and he lived in a long and narrow townhouse with a basement. Running the length of the basement, he had a long runner-style carpet over the concrete. He gave me 2 bent pieces of stiff wire, so I held these L-shaped wires in front of me, kind of like a pair of pistols, held loosely enough they could pivot, and the idea was they would cross when I was over water. I walked the length of the basement 3 or 4 times, and sure enough, at the same point each time, they swung inwards and crossed. I knew where the water lines in the house were, they were above my head and none at that point. I asked what was up, and he pulled up the carpet. In blue chalk, under the carpet, he simply had drawn a line with the word water. When I moved into an apartment my senior year of college, my roommates and I found an alarm clock we thought was left over by the old tenants. We thought nothing of it and had no use for it, so it just stayed in the closet for a few months. After the first month of living there, it would randomly go off at night, never at the same time as a set alarm. It was not plugged into anything. We tried to write it off as it probably had an internal battery. Being a bunch of engineering students, we decided to take it apart to check for the battery one day. There was none. And even in pieces, it continued to go off at night. At this point, we were freaked out and ended up throwing it in the dumpster outside where we heard it going off at night still until the garbage man came that week. We named the ghost Sophie and it's a running joke for us now, and a great but creepy story. We still have no explanation as to how it was possible. When I lived in Tennessee, I lived next to a Confederate graveyard. Nothing huge, but there it was. At night, things got real spooky and there was never any noise, no birds, no crickets, not even frogs or something at the creek near our house. One night, I'm out walking our dogs, and my back's turned to this lamppost that's about 20 foot away, maybe less. Then, all of a sudden, my dogs start growling, hackles raised and everything, and the hair on the back of my neck just stands straight up. I felt super staticky and immediately paranoid. So I turn around, and standing under the lamppost is a beige figure without a face, like a sepia-toned slender man in khaki coveralls. It wasn't even faceless like one of those cover masks, it was just a completely smooth, featureless blank. I'm obviously freaked out, but I'm kinda frozen, and my dogs are going nuts. The thing's just standing there staring at me, then it starts walking forward towards me. So I pick up my dogs and goes back inside. As I'm moving, I hear a breeze but didn't feel anything, and I glance back, and the thing's gone. We were in the open, so there wasn't anywhere it could have gotten to. I get inside, spend the rest of the night feeling like I'm being watched, but eventually I forget about it. Fast forward 3 years, I'm in college working as a janitor, and I see the thing walk through a wall in front of me, then through a locked door. Haven't seen it since. There is also a ghost that has haunted my college campus for the last 4 or 5 years. We named her Margaret, and she would stand in the laundry room of the house I lived in and watch me walk up and down the stairs. Nobody acknowledged her, cause none of us wanted a haunting on our hands. Day I moved out, she got closer and closer every time I went up and down, and then she just vanished. My boss and my supervisor saw her later on. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.